That means that both the Nephilim X and Y chromosomes were polluting mankind after the flood. There is more evidence. If the Adamic genes had been the only ones still on the earth, then all the X and Y genes today would be identical, and we would all look the same. But we all look different. So there must be non-Adamic genes in nearly all of us. This can be explained if Nephilim genes have infected mankind. In other words, nearly all of us on the planet may be contaminated with the genes of Belial, Romans 11:32. The good news of the New Testament is that the sons of disobedience, which is Paul's favorite term for the sons of Belial, have been saved by Christ, and need only accept what Paul calls the gift of God, that no one should boast, Ephesians 2:1-22. The Bible insists that our destiny is not written upon our genes, but upon our hearts, that is, our spirits. God calls all to repentance, but only a few are dragged in as Paul had to be, struck down on the road to Damascus. We all have free will to choose to believe, but not all have a love of the truth so as to be saved. 2 Thessalonians 2:10. Yet, if all of this were known to the original apostles, how is it that the Roman Church came to reject the story of the corruption of mankind by the Nephilim? Pagan Rome traced its roots back to Romulus, who murdered his brother Remus and fled into exile, the story of Cain and Abel. But the Romans rejected any attack on the behavior of Romulus. To the Romans, Romulus was their founder and nearly a god. Romans were not eager to adopt a religion in which their spiritual founder was called by Jesus, John 8:44, a murderer from the beginning, the father of lies. Romans had worshipped Romulus as the ancestor of their royal rulers. Christianity contended that Romulus was, if not Cain himself, one like Cain, an heir of the evil one, Revelation 17:10. Rome felt driven to persecute Christianity that said the ancestor of Rome's rulers was, in effect, the Nephilim heir of Satan, Cain/Belial, the first head of the beast. There could be no end to the persecutions unless Christianity abandoned this idea and absolved Rome and its ruling patrician elite from any taint of being sons of Belial. Yet, this is exactly what the Bible indicated, especially in the book of Revelation, where it detailed the various manifestations of Satan in the guise of world-ruling empires leading up to the one that now is in John's day, namely Rome, Revelation 17:10. There was no way around this accusation unless Rome acknowledged Nephilim ancestry, or unless the leaders of the church abandoned their faith in the literal text of the Bible. In the 4th century, the Church of Rome surrendered. From that point forward, Catholicism could no longer properly view the history of the world from a biblical perspective. It could no longer see that the pagan gods were actually the descendants of Cain and his twin sister. It could no longer trace the details of Gentile history, because it was so entangled with the stories of gods and goddesses. The Church of Rome was left to dismiss it all as silly myths of no value. Thus, it was not the repeated pagan burning of libraries that deprived mankind of access to its past, but rather, it was the cowardice of the Church in abandoning its own beliefs that led it to devalue whatever history survived the flames. Ironically, the pagan myths themselves detailed the sins and perfidy of their gods. They were not shy about detailing all their adulteries, rapes, treacheries, and murders. But when the Church decided it was all unworthy fable, the pagan gods became absolved of their guilt. Pagans were deprived of the need to explain the real reason for their gods' mendacity and wickedness. And if their gods were mythical, then paganism was not the slavish worship of the Nephilim by the sons of Belial, but rather, merely a foolish fantasy engaged in by uneducated bumpkins. Not to worry, no dragons there. Once this notion was accepted by Rome, it was easy for the Enlightenment to adopt the same dismissive view of pagan myth and extend it to the Church itself. That led first to ridicule of its beliefs, then discrimination, and finally persecution, as the French Revolution and numerous other slaughters by illumined leaders have demonstrated. The same ancient satanic pride that vaunts itself above other angels and even God himself, the pride that elevated Cain above Abel, and the sons of Cain above those of Seth, the pride that forced its seed on the daughters of Adam, the pride that made pagans see uncooperative Israelites as sons of an inborn madness, as Roman Emperor Constantine declared, and Christians as a threat to the very survival of Rome, as various other emperors had assured its citizens, that same pride assured Islam. It was proper to force the world to bend to its will, and led the Vatican to crush dissenting Christians, and led communists, Nazis, and a host of others to murder all who got in their way, because they hinder the achievement of an always elusive greater good. Yes, and that is the same pride that convinces us all that everything would be just fine if only we could compel everyone else to submit to our personal utopian vision of how things ought to be. The spirit of the Nephilim will eagerly course through all of our veins if we let it. It will delight in justifying every evil we may wish to commit for our cause, and will leap with joy if it can lure us into crediting God for our vilest actions. It is why we long for leaders who promise to fix everything to our liking. There is nothing new in our bad habits. From the beginning, mankind has sought to dominate its fellows. That is but the most obvious heritage of our Nephilim past. Cain's pride led him to found a city named after his Nephilim son. Remember, technically all Cain and Lilith's offspring were Nephilim. They were giant descendants of Cain, Ginsburg, PXXII, and they would also interbreed with the Nephilim, Genesis 6:1. That included Lamech's sons, Jubal, Jabal, and Tubal-Cain. To the Greeks, being proud of their own myths, these three pre-flood giants had become Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. They were rivals for dominion with their father, Kronos. He would correspond to the pre-flood descendant of Cain whom the Bible calls Lamech, Genesis 4:16-24. The clues linking Kronos to Lamech are now almost buried. In Sumer, he was called Lamha, but also known there as Enki or as Ea in Akkadian. Turner, Oxford Dictionary of Ancient Deities, pages 161a, 167, 296b. He fathered the patrons of various arts and crafts before the flood. He was fed magical plants and vomited out gods. This is similar to the story of Kronos, who was fed a stone by Zeus and vomited up Hades and Poseidon, both of whom he had swallowed. Turner, p. 135. Kronos had killed his father, just as Lamech, while hunting for something to eat, was claimed to have killed his ancestor, Cain. Ginsburg, Legends of the Bible, pages XXXXIB, 60-61. This is a good example of how early traditions about pre-flood events became muddled, pages XXXXIB. Likewise, Egyptian tradition says there had been a great famine in Egypt when Osiris, King Belial, and his family reached the Nile Valley, where people were reduced to cannibalism. Ice core data has confirmed that the peak of the last ice age was so severe, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels fell low enough to endanger the survival even of plant life. See Confessions of a Greenpeace Dropout, The Making of a Sensible Environmentalist, by Patrick Moore, published on November 22, 2010. The myths claim Osiris/Cain/Belial saved the Egyptians by teaching them how to grow their own food. They make him the king, first of the pharaohs. He went on a world tour, teaching agriculture. This implies he was responding to a global famine and that he established the first global empire. Science confirms that the first known cultivated grain was in the Nile Valley, in the Biome, and dates to that same epoch, c. 18,000 years ago. So Cain, a sibling murderer, who was viewed by his own mother as cannibalistic, Ginsburg, p. 55, sought to redeem himself by teaching agriculture, and was later nearly killed by his other brother, Seth, or shot with an arrow by his hungry descendant Lamech. The basic elements of the Kronos myth are in Cain's story: generational family feuding over global dominion, famine and cannibalism, the murder of relatives, 3 competing brothers, giants and gods or angels, dead patriarchs who don't stay dead, Revelation 13:1-15. And both stories take place in that misty realm of the pre-flood world. Cultures around the world have retained bits and pieces of the same traditions. Nearly all recall the flood, the garden, a serpent, or trickster, the mixing of the seeds of gods and men, the feuding brothers, the fratricide and exile of the farmer, the famine and the giant cannibals. The details vary, of course, but it is clear they are recalling a common record of humanity's earliest memories. The Bible barely hints at the famine that has so crucial a role in pagan myths. We are told that Adam will sweat to mill grain for bread, that the earth will bring forth thorns and thistles for him, and that it will not yield its full output for Cain. Genesis 3:17-19, 4:12. Even so, the rabbis did glean a famine from these few texts. They also inferred that there were giants. Of course, it is conceivable pagan myths and Jewish legends had cross-pollinated over the course of time. Still, science is now gradually confirming these stories. It has found that there was a global sea level surge at the end of the Ice Age, that there were a lot of very large human skeletons then, averaging 8 inches taller than today, and that human DNA shows a genetic bottleneck, as small as 1 man and 1 woman, occurred 23,000 years ago near Israel, around the time animals were first domesticated. This date is crucial. While scientific creationists have been trying to impose a 6,000-year medieval view of history on a Bible that makes no such assertion and whose Hebrew text requires no such interpretation, they have squandered a golden opportunity to show how the scriptures are actually being supported by scientific discoveries. The Jewish people, however, were not misled. Their rabbis had been telling them for ages, Genesis 1:2, 2:24, Isaiah 34:11, 45:18, Jeremiah 4:23, Ephesians 3:5, Colossians 1:26, that the world was a lot older than Adam's time, at least 7 times older. In fact, Ginsburg, pages 2, 26, 59-60, more extensive documentation will be found in my book, Paradise Found. Fear of the rabbis kept Christians from studying their works. This led churches to be seduced by pseudoscience that appealed to their pride. They wanted to believe that mankind was nearly as old as the heavens and the earth. They lost touch with biblical Hebrew, relying on the Masonic authorized King James Version, KJV, which used poor medieval manuscripts. History of the Bible in English, 3rd ed., by F. F. Bruce, Oxford University Press. New York, 1978, pages 96-112. The KJV is not an inspired translation, only 10% was newly done, updating the Bible of the Anglican Church, of whom the Masonic King, James I was head, pages 98-111. James intended it to wipe out the Protestant Reformation's Geneva Bible, pages 96-97. The KJV was used by Anglicans to persecute Protestants and burn their Bibles, but Protestants kept using the Geneva long after it was outlawed, p. 111 and 2. If forced to use a KJV, pastors searched out the underlying Hebrew and Greek texts, ignoring the KJV's Anglican doctrinal bias. The KJV propaganda failed. By the 1800s, Bible-believing Protestant churches had realized the Bible said the world was far older than 6,000 years. Even though scientific creationists admitted that all the Bible colleges then taught an old earth, the Genesis record by Henry M. Morris, Baker Book House, Grand Rapids, MI, 1976, pages 40-46. When one realizes that the Bible does not teach a 6,000-year-old universe, but has a much longer time frame, it is easy to match the scientific record to the Genesis history. Reading it in Hebrew, the old rabbis realized there is a 7-fold chronology in Genesis. On this scale, the deluge fell 11,600 years ago as sea level rose at the end of the last ice age. Adam and Eve lived 7x 1,656 years earlier, or 23,000 years ago, consistent with DNA evidence. The Search for Eve by Michael H. Brown, Harper and Row, New York, 1990, pages 32, 100, 111, 239, 302, 314. Cain's famine fell 18,000 years ago, where the hard datum now places one. Noah's post-deluge migrations from Ararat now line up with a series of sites leading to Göbekli Tepe and Edessa in Turkey, National Geographic. June, 2011, pages 34-59. Post-flood agriculture begins when and where Genesis said. Egypt's settlement corresponds nicely. The date of Babel's language divergence matches what modern linguists find. Scientific American, May 2016, pages 61-65. Using the ancient rabbinical 7-fold chronology, the agreement of the Bible with history and science is easily shown. So, if all this is true, how did we get misled about Genesis history and the Nephilim? This is nothing new. The Jewish legends recount that the very first thing the Nephilim did, after beginning to defile the daughters of Adam, Genesis 6:1-2, was to teach mankind their faulty version of science and history. Ginsburg, pages 62-65. If anyone doubts that fallen angels lie about history, the most fundamentalist believer need only turn to Genesis 3:1 and look at the first words of the serpent as he tempted Eve. Indeed, did God say, "You shall not eat of any tree of the garden"? His first was to rewrite God's history, creating confusion about what God had actually said. In fact, his version was the opposite of what God had told Adam. Eve was not fooled. She corrected Satan, saying they could eat of any tree, but not the one in the midst of the garden. So far, so good. But then she added something God had not said. We must neither eat it, nor touch it, lest we die. Genesis 3:4. Satan was ready for this. He was apparently touching the fruit, for he perceived that it was not harming him. So she falsely assumed it was safe to eat. But God never said touching it would harm anyone. From where had Eve gotten this idea? Had someone already lied to her about what God had said? Who would have told her to not even touch the fruit, lest she die? Adam. There really is no other candidate suggested by the text. God had given the fruit tree warning to Adam, and he had told Eve about it. So Adam told her a lot. Of course, he loved Eve and wanted to keep her safe. It must have seemed like a small thing to exaggerate God's warning just a little bit in the hope that it might help keep her safe. There's just one little problem with this argument. Jesus stated that the devil, from the beginning, is a liar and the father of lies. John 8:44. In effect, Jesus indicated Adam was not the first to lie. Satan was. That implies that Satan had lied to Adam before